In the morning, friendos. Welcome to today's News and Guidance show for Tuesday, August 4th, 2026. Coming at you live from a Pambazo stand in a Mexican street market. Let's look at today's items. I'm your host, Fidges DeFis.
And I'm Matter. It's fantastic to be here with you.
So today we're really diving into how a microscopic parasite that's just hiding in a single head of iceberg lettuce perfectly mirrors a $90 million AI crypto heist.
Yeah, which sounds completely disconnected, but it's really not.
Right. We're talking about all these invisible systems that are, basically keeping your world functioning, how deeply interconnected they are, and frankly, how rapidly they're kind of just collapsing under the weight of their own complexity right now.
Exactly. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. But before we pull that thread, just a quick reminder for you. News and Guidance is a value-for-value program. We have absolutely no corporate overlords dictating this run of show.
Thank goodness for that.
Seriously. So if you get value from what you're hearing today, if we help you connect some dots, zap the show using your favorite podcasting 2.0 app, keep the signal strong.
And speaking of parallel economies and keeping things independent, you're only to head over to smallbatchsteve.com.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, you can actually buy his incredible artisanal seasonings using Bitcoin. I mean, the survival seasoning and taco seasoning pouches, they're available right now. So, secure your flavor, support the network, and just sort of step outside the traditional fiat rails.
Highly recommend the taco seasoning, by the way.
Oh.
But okay, let's set the stage for you. As we mentioned, we are conceptually broadcasting live today from the absolute chaotic, vibrant heart of a Mexico City street market.
The vibe here is just, it's incredible.
It really is. Like the smell of salsa guajillo frying into the bread of a pambazo is just thick in the air. And we chose this specific local anchor for you today because this stack of sources, it really requires us to ground ourselves in physical reality.
Right. We have to start at the bottom.
Exactly. We're going to trace a line from hyper-local community infrastructure right here in Mexico, straight through these massive global agricultural supply chains, across international conflict zones, and ultimately end up just staring at the bleeding edge of AI cybersecurity.
And a street market it's actually the perfect lens for this.
How so?
Well, you look around, and to the untrained eye, it's just pure chaos.
Right.
Vendors shouting, people moving, goods exchanging hands.
Yeah, it looks totally random.
But underneath that surface layer, there is this incredibly rigid, unwritten architecture. There are, strict rules of supply, demand, community trust, and logistics.
Right.
And what we are examining today in this deep dive is what happens when those underlying architectures, whether we're talking about public health frameworks, international diplomacy, or, artificial intelligence, when they either adapt to protect us or when they just completely fracture.
And we are seeing a massive adaptation right here in the urban fabric of Mexico City that, honestly, most of the world is completely sleeping on.
Yeah, they really are.
We're looking at the recent completion of 500 renovated public football pitches. Now, on paper, this was like a post-World Cup legacy project. But they paired this athletic infrastructure with a massive scaling of urban rainwater harvesting systems.
Which is such a brilliant dual-purpose idea.
It is. And these systems are specifically designed for residential and localized community use.
The psychology of this urban planning is what's truly compelling here. Historically, if you look at what happens when a city hosts a mega event like the Olympics or the World Cup,
it's usually a disaster for the locals.
Exactly. The legacy is almost invariably this multi-billion-dollar, 80,000-seat stadium that eventually just becomes a white elephant.
Right, it just sits there.
It sits empty, it costs millions a year to maintain, and it drains municipal resources for literally decades.
So what did Mexico City do differently?
Well, they took the raw capital and the political momentum of a global mega event, and they shattered it into 500 hyper-local pieces. Yeah. They took the abstract corporate concept of global sports and metabolized it into these tangible daily assets for the actual citizens.
I mean, it fundamentally rewrites the gravity of a neighborhood. You carve out a safe space for kids to play, you create a focal point for adults to gather on weekends, and you're essentially artificially engineering social cohesion.
That's exactly what it is.
But then you look at the rainwater harvesting aspect of it, and that is just raw, gritty survivalism.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you have the high-profile glitz of World Cup funding juxtaposed against the absolute localized necessity of just catching water from the sky simply because the municipal pipes are running dry.
Right, and implementing rainwater harvesting at this kind of scale, it isn't just about, handing out plastic buckets to people.
Yeah, it's way more complex than that.
It requires retrofitting decentralized municipal plumbing. I mean, you're talking about installing specialized roof catchments, first flush diverters to keep the smog and the debris out of the supply,
Yeah.
and these massive subterranean cisterns.
So it's serious engineering.
It really is. Planners are demonstrating a dual awareness here. The football pitches address social decay, while the rainwater systems address existential resource resilience.
That makes total sense.
Because a city is essentially a biological organism. If you don't hydrate its cells and you don't give those cells a mechanism to interact, the tissue just goes necrotic.
Which brings us to how this organism actually fights off infection. Because Mexico City just permanently integrated the SIAT CDMX early warning platform.
Yes. And this is a quantum leap in epidemic intelligence.
Really? How so?
Well, to contextualize this for you, SIAT CDMX was originally spun up as a reactive measure for acute, localized crises. But public health officials have now hardwired it into the city's permanent operations.
Okay, so it's always running.
Exactly. It tracks infectious outbreaks in real time, strictly adhering to the syndromic surveillance standards set by the Pan American Health Organization.
Okay, so mechanically speaking, if we just strip away the bureaucratic jargon for a second, syndromic surveillance means this AI isn't waiting for a doctor in a clinic to, officially diagnose a patient and file paperwork in triplicate, right?
Right. It's much faster than that.
Because it's scraping metadata. So if there's, say, a 400% spike in over-the-counter anti-diarrheal sales at pharmacies in a 3-block radius of a specific neighborhood on a Tuesday, the system flags a potential waterborne pathogen anomaly by Wednesday morning.
You are exactly right on the mechanism, but the predictive modeling actually goes even deeper than that.
Wait, really?
Deeper than pharmacy sales? Yeah, it's not just pharmacy sales. It's ingesting data streams from school absenteeism records, public transit tap-in anomalies, and even localized spikes in specific keyword searches on mobile networks.
Oh, wow. So it's looking at everything.
Everything it can legally access, yeah.
Yeah.
And the math running in the background establishes a highly dynamic baseline for what constitutes, normal biological behavior in a specific zip code on a specific day of the week.
And I assume it adjusts for things like weather.
Weather, holidays, major events, all of it. And the moment a cluster of symptoms deviates from that baseline, the digital immune system triggers an alert.
That's incredible.
It allows health officials to deploy testing kits or, isolate a variable before the pathogen hits the exponential growth phase of an epidemic curve.
And this is exactly where the local intersects violently with the global. Because while Mexico City is actively constructing this amazing localized digital immune system, we have to look at what happens when these biological realities crash into international commerce.
Yeah, that transition is brutal.
Because we have a massive cross-border outbreak dominating the U.S. right now. The FDA and the CDC are actively investigating a severe cyclospora outbreak, and it's linked directly to iceberg lettuce exported from Taylor farms to Mexico.
And, the human toll here is significant. We are looking at 1,947 confirmed cases across 9 U.S. states.
That's a huge footprint.
It is. And tragically, there have been 2 deaths reported in Michigan among individuals who had pre-existing underlying conditions.
It really forces you to think about the modern agricultural supply chain as this, massive, invisible conveyor belt. I mean, think about your own habits. You walk into a grocery store in Michigan in the dead of winter, you buy a crisp head of lettuce, you make a salad, and you never once consider the sheer logistical miracle required to get it there.
Right, because you just expect it to be there.
Exactly. You don't think about the soil ecology down in Mexico, the sorting facilities, the cold chain logistics, the refrigerated trucks running diesel for 3,000 miles, the border checkpoints. The conveyor belt is entirely invisible to the consumer.
Until it breaks.
Until it breaks. We only remember how intimately tethered we are to our neighbors when that belt snaps, and suddenly contaminated produce ends up in a Midwestern refrigerator with fatal consequences.
And Cyclospora chitinensis is perhaps the most insidious pathogen that could possibly stress test this invisible conveyor belt.
Really? Why is that?
Well, if you look at the biological mechanics of it, it's not like a standard bacterial contamination.
Like E. coli or salmonella.
Exactly. With those, you might be able to mitigate the risk with a thorough wash or some sort of chemical rinse at the processing plant. But Cyclospora is a microscopic, single-celled coccidian parasite.
And it embeds itself deep in the crop, right? Usually through agricultural water runoff.
That's right. But here is the truly critical vulnerability. When the parasite is shed into the environment, it's immature.
Okay.
It's what's called an unsporulated oocyst, which means it isn't actually infectious yet.
Wait, so it can infect you right away?
No, it requires days, sometimes weeks, in specific environmental conditions outside a host to sporulate and actually become dangerous.
Oh, wow.
Combine that with a long incubation period in the human gut. I mean, it can take a week or two for the severe gastrointestinal symptoms to even present in the patient.
So the timeline completely obfuscates the crime scene.
Completely. By the time a patient in Michigan is sick enough to seek medical care, get a stool sample tested, and have public health officials actually confirm Cyclospora, that specific batch of iceberg lettuce has been digested.
Right, the plastic packaging is already sitting in a landfill somewhere.
Exactly. And the traceback investigation requires literal forensic miracles to pinpoint a single irrigation ditch on a single farm thousands of miles away.
It just highlights such a profound vulnerability in our baseline expectations of reality. Like, we casually demand fresh summer produce year-round, which mandates a hyper-globalized agricultural network, but our biological reality, our gut biome, is deeply, deeply local.
Yeah, the mismatch is staggering.
We are taking a microscopic parasite perfectly adapted to one ecosystem and overnighting it into the digestive tracts of a population living in a completely different biome.
Which naturally leads to intense friction regarding regulatory standards and inspections.
Yeah.
I mean, when a massive, highly sophisticated logistical operation like Taylor Farms suffers a breach of this magnitude, it just proves that even our most advanced, capital-intensive supply chains are entirely vulnerable to the simplest biological organisms on Earth.
Speaking of biological organisms and the friction of regulatory standards, let's pivot from foodborne illness to pharmaceutical preventative health, because the U.S. regulatory apparatus is facing its own intense structural paradox right now.
They absolutely are. The FDA is staring down a hard Wednesday deadline to make a final approval decision on Moderna's experimental mRNA-based flu shot.
But this decision isn't just happening in a vacuum. It is landing squarely in the middle of a massive wave of regulatory and market uncertainty, heavily driven by Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has continued to vocally and publicly question the safety and efficacy of mRNA technology.
Now, when we look at this through a systems analysis lens, we really have to map out the opposing forces causing this friction.
Let's lay it out.
So on one side, you have the established biomedical consensus arguing that mRNA platforms are essentially the definitive future of preventative medicine.
Right.
They argue that the ability to rapidly sequence a pathogen and iterate a targeted vaccine within weeks, rather than the years required for traditional attenuated virus methods, is a species-level advantage.
Right. The speed is the main selling point. And on the other side, you have a deep skepticism championed by the health secretary, arguing that the lipid nanoparticle delivery mechanisms used in these mRNA shots represent novel, untested variables.
Exactly.
That side demands multi-year longitudinal safety data regarding biodistribution and potential cellular toxicity before these platforms are authorized for annual mass population rollout like a standard flu shot. And to be clear to you listening, we're just outlining the positions here.
Yes, those are the two deeply entrenched positions. But what we need to focus on in this deep dive is the result of these two forces colliding at the highest levels of government.
The actual fallout.
Right. Pharmaceutical development is entirely dependent on astronomical capital investment. Taking a molecule from a laboratory bench to a commercial product requires billions of dollars and decades of rigorous clinical trials.
It's not a cheap process.
Not at all. Private equity and institutional investors only allocate that kind of capital when they can reliably calculate risk versus reward. And that calculation is entirely dependent on a stable, predictable regulatory framework.
So when you introduce this massive paradox, the FDA is actively evaluating a technology for approval, while the boss of the entire health department is publicly expressing deep skepticism about the fundamental safety of that exact technology. How on earth does an investor price in that risk?
They can't.
Yeah.
The mathematical models just break down. If you're sitting on a board deciding whether to greenlight phase 3 trials for a new mRNA-based cancer therapeutic, and you see this level of profound political and regulatory dissonance at the federal level, you freeze.
You just hold your money.
Exactly. The uncertainty triggers immediate capital flight.
It creates a chilling effect across the entire industry. It's fascinating because we so often treat political appointments and cabinet-level ideological debates as just like cable news fodder.
Right,
Yeah.
like it's just talk.
But they aren't abstract. They dictate actual physical reality. A philosophical debate in Washington today mathematically dictates whether a life-saving therapy actually exists in a hospital 5 years from now, or if the funding dried up in a boardroom because the regulatory risk was just too high.
It perfectly illustrates how policy uncertainty acts as a hard bottleneck for scientific innovation. Whether you view that bottleneck as a crucial, long overdue safety precaution or as an unscientific bureaucratic disaster, the resulting chilling effect on market capital is an undeniable empirical reality.
Which flows perfectly into Section 2 of our stack today, because this tension between policy intent and actual human outcome brings us directly to the broader social safety net. Let's look at who actually gets protected by government policy, how domestic political gridlock physically shapes the lives of the most vulnerable.
Let's bring our focus back to Mexico City for a moment. We discussed their physical infrastructure, but their socioeconomic policy engineering is equally aggressive right now.
Oh, yeah.
Authorities have just launched a program called the Pensión Hombres Bienestar.
And this is a highly targeted financial aid program explicitly built for men aged 60 to 64.
Right, and running in parallel to that, Mayor Clara Brugada just unveiled a comprehensive 10-point plan explicitly designed to combat illegal home seizures, with a laser focus on protecting elderly homeowners from being displaced.
Okay, let's dissect the mechanics of this because it feels incredibly intentional. Why target men specifically between the ages of 60 and 64? And why is title fraud and home seizure such an existential threat to the elderly right now?
Well, to understand the pension, you have to look at the actuarial tables and the labor demographics of a rapidly developing megacity. Global social programs typically use these massive, broad strokes.
Right, one size fits all.
But Mexico City planners identified a critical vulnerability gap. Men in this specific 60 to 64 age bracket find themselves in a brutal socioeconomic gray zone.
How so?
They're aging out of the physically demanding manual labor sectors that often dominate the informal economy, meaning their earning potential just plummets.
But they can't get retirement yet.
Exactly. They haven't yet reached the statutory age threshold required to access older age national pensions. They literally fall into a 4-year chasm of extreme poverty. By designing a bespoke pension for this precise demographic, the city is deploying a targeted intervention to catch a vulnerable population right before they hit the ground.
It's a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. And the home seizure plan operates on that exact same logic.
Precisely. In rapidly gentrifying urban centers, real estate values skyrocket. Elderly individuals who hold the deed to their property, but perhaps lack sophisticated legal literacy, financial resources, or aggressive family support networks, they become incredibly lucrative targets.
It's terrifying.
It is. We are talking about sophisticated syndicates utilizing forged documents, corrupt notaries, and predatory legal maneuvers to execute title fraud and outright illegal evictions. Mayor Brugada's 10-point plan acknowledges a grim reality. Simply having a law on the books that says stealing houses is illegal is entirely insufficient. You must build specialized enforcement mechanisms to shield the people who literally lack the capital to fight back in court.
It's bespoke policy engineering at its finest. But then, you contrast this highly targeted approach with what is happening right now in the United States regarding federal Medicaid.
The juxtaposition is severe. The U.S. is currently embroiled in intense pushback over new federal Medicaid work requirements. The primary criticism dominating the landscape right now is that these broad federal mandates completely fail to include exemptions for homeless individuals.
This legitimately blows my mind. You look at Mexico City, a developing urban center, meticulously using a scalpel to carve out safety nets for hyper-specific micro-demographics. And then you look at the United States, arguably the wealthiest nation in human history, implementing a policy sledgehammer that is actively dropping its most profoundly vulnerable population, the unhoused, completely off the grid.
The sledgehammer metaphor is highly accurate here. A work requirement for Medicaid access is constructed on a very specific, rigid ideological framework. The premise that able-bodied adults must prove economic productivity to warrant state-funded medical benefits.
Right.
But when you apply that ideological framework uniformly and fail to account for the chaotic, barrier-filled reality of homelessness, the policy mathematically cannibalizes itself.
Right, because if you are living on the street, you don't have a permanent address.
Yeah.
And without an address, you can't get a state ID. Without a state ID, you cannot legally be onboarded by an employer.
Exactly. Add to that the lack of access to clean clothes, reliable communication, and the compounding issues of untreated mental health crises or addiction.
It's an impossible situation.
The individual's trapped in an inescapable bureaucratic loop. They cannot get the job required to secure the Medicaid, and without the Medicaid, they cannot access the medical or psychiatric stabilization required to maintain a job.
So they just get shut out.
The immediate result of the policy is that the exact demographic requiring the most intense, immediate medical intervention is administratively severed from the system.
It's a tragic systemic irony. And honestly, it speaks to a much deeper, more pervasive dysfunction. The U.S. political apparatus seems entirely paralyzed by gridlock right now. Let's pull a few threads from our stack to illustrate how this gridlock manifests. Starting at the state level, we have the intensely watched Michigan Senate primary.
Yes, Michigan Democrats are currently locked in a fierce primary battle, choosing between the progressive wing, represented by Abdul El-Sayed, and the establishment wing, represented by Haley Stevens, for a highly contested open Senate seat.
And we just spent significant time discussing Michigan. That is ground zero for the fatal cyclospora outbreak linked to the broken agricultural supply chain.
Which is the crucial connective tissue here. The constituents casting ballots in this macro-political primary, this ideological war for the future trajectory of the party, are the exact same humans trying to navigate the micro-level fallout of failing infrastructure.
Yeah.
They are voting while simultaneously worrying if the produce in their refrigerator is going to put them in the hospital. The local states of federal gridlock are incredibly high.
But the federal machinery is seizing up at every possible choke point. Look at the Department of Justice. The nomination of Todd Blanche to serve as the U.S. Attorney General is entirely stalled in committee.
The architecture of this stall is deeply revealing about modern political leverage. Republican Senators Tom Tillis and John Cornyn have placed a hard hold on the nomination. They are demanding a written, binding commitment from Blanche to permanently cancel a $1.8 billion fund.
And this fund is a massive flashpoint. It is ostensibly designed to compensate victims of alleged government weaponization.
Now, if we steelman both positions to understand the friction here, the conservative argument is that the executive branch has been weaponized against political opponents, and without financial restitution for those targeted, there is no deterrent against future abuses of power.
Okay, and the other side.
Conversely, the progressive argument views the fund as a blatant partisan misuse of $1.8 billion taxpayer dollars designed to reward political allies and manufacture a narrative of victimhood. Again, we're just conveying the ideas in the source material.
Of course. And because those two worldviews are fundamentally irreconcilable, the entire process breaks down.
Precisely. And the collateral damage is massive. The Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer of the entire nation. By stalling the nomination over this singular, highly polarized fund, strategic operations, long-term investigations, and leadership directives across the entire DOJ are placed in a paralyzed holding pattern.
Everything just stops.
It demonstrates how modern political warfare isn't fought through grand debate on the Senate floor. It is fought by exploiting procedural choke points to freeze the opposing side's machinery.
It's friction for the sake of friction. And we see this internal chaos bleeding into the legislative body as well. The House Ethics Committee has just formally opened an investigation into Ohio Republican Max Miller regarding severe allegations of domestic abuse. It injects a massive distraction and instability right into the core of the legislative process.
And this systemic distrust inevitably metastasizes into the electoral bedrock itself. We are currently watching a massive, cascading controversy regarding the integrity of voter rolls. State officials across multiple jurisdictions are expressing profound confusion and demanding evidence regarding presidential claims that upwards of 250,000 non-U.S. citizens are currently registered on active voter rolls.
And the judicial branch is now being dragged into the fray. A federal judge just issued a ruling rejecting an attempt by outside groups to force access to Illinois voter data to investigate these exact claims.
And look, whether you believe the federal judge is correctly shielding sensitive state data from partisan fishing expeditions, or you believe the judge is actively suppressing necessary audits of a compromised system, the net result is identical. An atmosphere of absolute fundamental distrust.
It's exhausting just watching it.
When the executive branch, state election officials, and the federal judiciary are locked in a sprawling legal war over the basic underlying ledger of democracy, the voter rolls, it consumes a staggering amount of institutional energy. The system spends all its time fighting over the rules of the game rather than actually governing.
Which brings us to a story from the stack that is so perfectly illustrative of this exact dynamic. I almost couldn't believe it when I read it. Let's talk about the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool.
Oh, this is a remarkable case study in bureaucratic psychology. Federal prosecutors recently filed a motion to quietly dismiss property destruction charges against a man named David Hearn.
Right. Because previously, the government, backed by statements from the administration, had very publicly and aggressively claimed that vandals had maliciously slashed the liner of the reflecting pool, causing massive damage and draining all the water.
They pointed a very public finger. They established a narrative of malicious external actors attacking a national monument. But now, in the quiet dismissal of these charges, the government is officially admitting that the damage was not the result of vandalism at all.
It was caused by flawed installation by a government contractor.
It was a structural internal failure, not an external attack.
Okay, I have to propose a theory here, because this isn't just about a leaky pool. Look at everything we just discussed. The voter roll lawsuits, the stalled DOJ nominations, the catastrophic Medicaid work rules. How often does our massive governmental apparatus, whether it's attempting to engineer a complex social safety net, adjudicate an election dispute, or literally just waterproof a concrete pond jump immediately to blame malicious actors, political enemies, or phantom vandals, before it ever bothers to look at its own fundamentally flawed installations?
That is the core psychological pathology of large bureaucracies. It is a defense mechanism scaled up to the federal level.
Right.
It is always, mathematically and politically, easier to externalize a failure. If an ambitious social policy fails to deliver, the architects will claim it was sabotaged by the opposing party's obstructionism.
Or if a monument leaks, it must be anarchists.
Exactly. Admitting internal systemic failure requires a forensic audit, it requires accountability, and it demands painful structural reform. Blaming a vandal is cheap. It requires no self-reflection, and it provides a perfectly clean narrative for the evening news.
We are right back to the invisible conveyor belt. When the belt snaps, the immediate instinct is to look for the saboteur who cut it, rather than admitting we bought a cheap, degraded belt and hired an incompetent contractor to install it.
And as we shift our focus to Section 3 of the stack, we're going to see exactly what happens when this deeply ingrained domestic instinct to externalize blame and engage in gridlock is projected onto a highly volatile, heavily armed global stage.
It's not a pretty picture.
No, the geopolitical tides are shifting rapidly, and the U.S. diplomatic apparatus is struggling to tread water.
The diplomatic strains are becoming incredibly explicit. The U.S. administration just made the unprecedented move of revoking the visa of Brazil's ambassador.
This cannot be overstated. Revoking an ambassador's visa is not a subtle bureaucratic reprimand.
It's a huge deal.
In the lexicon of international relations, it is the diplomatic equivalent of taking a sledgehammer to the negotiating table and walking out of the building.
Because it entirely severs the back-channel communications, right?
Exactly. Diplomacy relies on the ability of ambassadors to quietly de-escalate crises before they become public spectacles. Brazil is not a marginal player. They are a massive economic, agricultural, and geopolitical heavyweight in the Americas.
Right.
Alienating their chief diplomat creates immediate cascading friction across regional trade agreements, climate negotiations, and hemispheric security protocols. It's a massive escalation.
And it isn't just South America. We are seeing incredibly contradictory maneuvers in Africa as well. The U.S. just announced they are cutting aid to Rwanda.
Which requires serious unpacking, because when you look at the macro trends in global health and logistics, this decision appears deeply counterintuitive, if not outright self-defeating.
Right. Because Rwanda is objectively a global pioneer in utilizing autonomous drones for critical medical supply delivery. We literally just spent the first 20 minutes of this deep dive marveling at Mexico City's proactive digital immune system.
Right.
Rwanda has successfully built the physical manifestation of that. Companies like Zipline are flying blood transfusions, antivenoms, and vaccines over treacherous mountainous terrain via drone, bypassing broken road infrastructure to save lives in remote clinics, and the U.S. decides to cut their aid.
It highlights the schizophrenic nature of foreign policy, when diplomatic leverage is decoupled from functional, human-centric goals.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you have one arm of the global health community, heavily backed by U.S. philanthropic and private entities, holding Rwanda up as the gold standard for future healthcare logistics.
Because they're innovating.
Right. Simultaneously, a completely separate arm of the U.S. State Department decides to utilize aid as a weapon, likely to exert pressure regarding complex, deeply entrenched regional conflicts or human rights disputes in neighboring territories.
So the left hand is completely unaware of what the right hand is doing. Or worse, it knows and simply prioritizes the political leverage over the medical reality.
The downstream consequence is that you actively punish innovation. You defund a demonstrably successful, life-saving logistical framework in the developing world in order to score a point in a separate geopolitical dispute. It is the ultimate example of how macro-political friction inevitably destroys micro-level progress.
And the human cost of this global friction is currently playing out in real time across active conflict zones. The sheer devastation of supply chain failures and diplomatic vacuums is staggering. Let's look at the situation in Kyiv.
The reports detail a devastating, coordinated Russian air barrage targeting Kyiv. The attack involved 35 missiles and an overwhelming swarm of 185 drones.
My God.
9 civilians were killed in the strikes.
But the truly terrifying detail in this report came directly from President Zelensky. He stated that out of the 27 ballistic missiles fired during the barrage, only one was successfully intercepted. 1 out of 27. And the stated reason for this catastrophic failure rate: a critical systemic shortage of Patriot air defense systems.
This is exactly where domestic political gridlock translates directly into international casualties. The Patriot missile system is a marvel of engineering, but it is deeply embedded in a highly complex, U.S.-reliant defense supply chain.
It's not something you can just buy off the shelf.
No, you're talking about advanced solid-state radar components, highly specialized interceptor manufacturing lines that take years to scale, and massive financial appropriations. When funding bills stall in the U.S. Congress, or when the geopolitical focus pivots to a different theater, the logistical conveyor belt delivering those interceptors grinds to a halt.
It just stops.
When a major population center is staring down 27 incoming ballistic missiles, a delayed shipment isn't a political talking point about fiscal responsibility. It is a smoking crater in a residential neighborhood.
It is the ultimate terminal failure of the system. And we are seeing a different, equally harrowing kind of devastation unfolding in southern Lebanon.
Residents are currently attempting to return to the city of Nabatea following the recent Israeli ground invasion. The on-the-ground reports describe absolute, massive destruction of civilian infrastructure.
The human toll across the broader region is almost incomprehensible. Reports indicate over 4,200 Lebanese have been killed since the escalation began in March. And it's not just the modern infrastructure. The reports specifically note that historic ancient landmarks, such as the 12th century Beaufort Castle, are currently occupied by Israeli military forces.
When you place the realities of Kyiv and southern Lebanon side by side, you are looking at the extreme terminal edges of systemic breakdown.
Yeah.
The mechanisms of international diplomacy have categorically failed. The frameworks of military deterrence have failed, and civilian populations are left trapped in the crossfire of mechanized industrial-scale warfare.
It's just so bleak.
The international institutions explicitly designed in the post-WWII era to prevent or mitigate exactly these types of tragedies are currently operating completely offline, or they're so deeply compromised by internal divisions that they are effectively paralyzed.
It legitimately feels like the world is overheating, both metaphorically in terms of conflict and literally. Which brings us to the brutal intersection of climate stress and mass migration. Spain has just finalized the installation of a massive new sea barrier at its North African enclave territory of Ceuta.
And the immediate catalyst for this extreme infrastructure project was a massive frontier rush earlier in the week. Desperate migrants attempted to cross the border, resulting in a chaotic crush that killed 67 people.
67 human beings dying in a desperate attempt to cross an imaginary line on a map.
And this tragedy has completely reignited the incredibly polarized migration debates across the European Union. How does a sovereign nation balance the mandate for border security with fundamental human rights?
Right, it's the impossible question.
How do you manage the logistics of thousands of desperate people fleeing unlivable conditions? The construction of a physical sea barrier is a brutal, concrete, sledgehammer response to an incredibly nuanced socioeconomic and humanitarian crisis.
But it's a crisis that is being aggressively accelerated by the literal environment. There's a historically severe heat wave currently sweeping across the European continent. It is fueling devastating droughts and massive wildfires.
And the heat is having profound hydrological effects. The Danube River, one of the most vital waterways in Europe, is receding to such historically low levels that the literal wrecks of Nazi-era ships from World War II are emerging from the drying mud.
Okay, this image is so striking I can't shake it. The receding waters of the Danube feel like the perfect analogy for the current state of global diplomacy. Well, the sheer heat of all these compounding crises, the industrial wars, the mass migrations, the domestic political gridlock, it's rapidly evaporating the usual polite diplomatic surface waters that we've relied on for decades. And as the water level drops, it is revealing all these old, dangerous wrecks that we arrogantly assumed were buried in the mud forever. Historical border disputes, ancient tribal conflicts, the ugly, rusted machinery of the past is suddenly visible, and it's completely obstructing the flow of the present.
It's a highly evocative image, but I actually want to push back on the framing slightly.
Oh, why?
Calling them ghosts or wrecks of the past implies that these historical conflicts are dead and inert. They aren't. What the receding water of global stability is revealing isn't ghosts, it's unexploded ordnance.
Oh, wow.
These ancient grievances and border disputes are highly volatile, active leverage points. And malicious actors, whether state-sponsored or rogue entities, can now easily reach down into the mud, pick up these historical weapons, and use them to blow up modern diplomatic agreements.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 4, the cyber frontier. Because just as our physical borders, like Spain's concrete sea barrier, and our physical infrastructures are failing under the strain, our digital borders are facing an unprecedented, highly automated assault. We are crossing the threshold into an era that forces a fundamental, ground-up reevaluation of AI ethics, structural dependencies, and basic survival security.
Let's begin with the optimistic side of the ledger, because the promise of artificial intelligence remains staggering.
Yes, let's start with the good news.
Right here in Mexico City, the United Nations Deputy Secretary General recently concluded a massive global summit explicitly focused on the ethical policy frameworks required to ensure AI development actually serves human flourishing.
The ultimate goal is to figure out how to harness this immense computational power to elevate humanity, right? Like the SIAT CDMX health system we talked about at the top of the show, using predictive data models to identify pathogens and literally save lives before a crisis hits.
Yes, and the raw technological leaps we are witnessing are genuinely paradigm shifting. OpenAI has just unveiled their new Astra model.
Right? I saw that.
And it is crucial to understand that this is not just an incremental update. It is a fundamental shift in architecture. Astra is designed specifically for complex, multi-step, long-running tasks.
And the reports indicate it has already successfully solved 10 long-standing, incredibly complex problems in mathematics and computer science.
This is exactly what researchers mean when they discuss the trajectory toward artificial general intelligence, or at least the deployment of highly autonomous AI agents.
So it's not just a chatbot anymore?
No. Astra is not just a standard large language model chatbot that spits out a predicted token response in 5 seconds. It is a persistent agent. You can hand it a massively complex physics or math problem, and it will sit there and just think. It will iterate, test hypotheses, recognize its own dead ends, rewrite its approach, and maintain its context window for hours or even days until it cracks the solution. Solving 10 long-standing math problems is empirical proof of concept that these models are no longer just summarizing human knowledge, they are actively generating novel scientific insights.
It sounds like pure magic. It sounds like we are standing on the precipice of a techno-utopia where autonomous AI agents rapidly cure genetic diseases, solve the physics required for commercial fusion energy, and optimize our supply chains flawlessly.
What?
But there is always a massive but, and in this case, it is absolutely terrifying. Let's contrast that optimistic UN Ethical Summit with the findings of the newly released ANZ AI Security Outlook report.
This report provides a comprehensive analysis of the cybersecurity landscape across Australia and New Zealand, and their primary conclusion is bone-chilling. They state unequivocally that modern cybersecurity has officially crossed the threshold into machine-speed warfare.
Machine-speed warfare. So, to make sure I'm grasping the scale of this, is this basically like high-frequency trading algorithms on Wall Street? But instead of trading stocks, they're trading exploits and malware, where the algorithms are identifying vulnerabilities and executing breaches faster than the human eye can even render the alert on a dashboard.
That is an incredibly precise analogy.
Oh.
Traditionally, the cybersecurity landscape was a game of cat and mouse played at human speed. A human hacker probes a network, discovers a vulnerability, manually writes a script, and executes a breach.
Right.
On the other side, human defenders monitor network traffic, spot the anomaly, analyze the threat, and manually push a patch. It takes days, weeks, or months.
But with AI.
With AI, the attacker is completely automated. It is an agent, much like the Astra model we just discussed, but heavily optimized for destruction and infiltration. It can simultaneously probe millions of endpoints across a corporate network, identify an undocumented zero-day vulnerability, write a bespoke exploit for that specific flaw, execute the breach, exfiltrate the proprietary data, and then dynamically rewrite its own malware code to avoid signature detection, all in a matter of milliseconds.
So a human defender literally cannot react. By the time the IT guy's pager goes off, the war is already over, the data is gone, and the system is compromised.
Exactly. And here is the statistic from the report that should keep every CEO, every hospital administrator, and every government official awake at night.
Brace yourselves for this one.
The security audit found that 100% of the tested enterprise AI systems contained critical, exploitable flaws.
100%, not a majority, not most. Every single one of them. Let's actually make this our clip of the day because we need to let that phrase ring in our ears for a second. Machine speed warfare.
Machine speed warfare.
It sounds like bad sci-fi. It sounds like the prologue to a Terminator movie. But they aren't theorizing about a distant dystopian future. They are describing a very real, currently active, 100% vulnerable present reality.
If 100% of enterprise AI systems possess critical flaws, it means we have hastily built our entire modern digital infrastructure, the systems running our power grids, our financial markets, and our hospitals on a foundation of sand. And the automated tide is coming in at machine speed.
It connects directly to the terrifying digital supply chain attacks we're seeing dominate the news cycle right now. We talked earlier about how a microscopic parasite on Taylor Farms iceberg lettuce broke the physical supply chain. In the digital world, the equivalent of that parasite is a new malware called ChainDrop.
ChainDrop is a self-propagating malware that has successfully infected over 1,300 packages on the NPM registry.
Now, for you listeners who aren't software engineers, we don't need to get bogged down in the deep acronyms here. But conceptually, when a developer builds an app, they don't write every line of code from scratch.
Right, that would take forever.
Exactly. They pull pre-written blocks of code libraries from massive open source registries to save time.
It's all about dependency trees. If you build a financial app, you might import a calendar library to help users schedule payments. But that calendar library might independently rely on 20 other smaller libraries for formatting text or calculating time zones.
So it's layered.
Very layered. The developer of the main app has zero visibility into the security of those nested dependencies deep down the tree.
The invisible conveyor belt returns.
Precisely. If an attacker manages to poison one deeply nested package on the registry with ChainDrop malware, you aren't just attacking one application. You are simultaneously attacking every single piece of software on Earth that relies on that dependency tree.
That's terrifying.
The report indicates this single infection affects software with billions of monthly downloads. It is the digital equivalent of the Cyclospora outbreak, but instead of lettuce, it's the apps on your phone and the back-end software running your bank.
And the threat vectors are mutating and multiplying constantly. We are seeing a new variant of the XEScent malware explicitly targeting macOS developers. It compromises Xcode projects and GitHub repositories. They aren't just attacking the users anymore, they are actively poisoning the well where the developers go to get their tools.
And then you have the passkey exploits. Security researchers have documented new attack vectors that allow malware to completely hijack Google-synced passkeys on Windows devices.
Which is a big deal, right?
It's a critical blow because it entirely bypasses biometric user verification. You assume your account is secure because it requires your fingerprint or Face ID, but the malware simply steals the underlying session token, sidesteps the biometric lock completely, and takes full control of the account.
It's a fundamental erosion of trust in the concept of authentication itself. If you cannot mathematically prove you are who you say you are, and a machine can perfectly mimic your cryptographic credentials, the entire concept of secure digital interaction collapses.
Which brings us to perhaps the most fascinating and terrifying technical failure in the stack today. The random number generation flaw discovered in the cold card hardware wallet, which resulted in the theft of approximately $88.6 million in Bitcoin.
Okay, let's dive into the mechanics of this because it sounds absurd on the surface. How does a flaw in random numbers lead to $90 million vanishing? I thought hardware wallets were supposed to be the ultimate unhackable cold storage, which frankly is just another reason you should probably spend your Bitcoin on small batch Steve's seasonings and secure your physical flavor before a hacker figures out how to exploit your wallet's math.
A highly tactical move on your part. But the mechanics of this cold card flaw perfectly illustrate how esoteric and brittle these security architectures actually are. Cryptography, at its core, relies entirely on entropy-true, unpredictable randomness.
Right.
When a hardware wallet generates your private keys, it needs a random seed. If a computer chip generates a number, it isn't truly random. It's a pseudo-random number generator, a PRNG, following a deterministic mathematical curve.
Because silicon chips are logical machines. They can't do random without an external physical input, like measuring thermal noise or something.
Exactly. And if the PRNG implementation is flawed, or if the entropy source is biased, the output becomes predictable. In cryptographic signatures, specifically the nonces used when you sign a Bitcoin transaction to send funds, if an attacker can detect even a tiny bias in how those random numbers are generated across multiple transactions, they can run complex lattice attacks to reverse engineer the hidden private key directly from the public signatures on the blockchain.
Like the famous Sony PlayStation 3 hack years ago.
Exactly like that. It is a flaw that no human could ever detect by looking at the code, and no user could ever prevent. It is a microscopic mathematical vulnerability buried deep in silicon, and the result is the instantaneous, irreversible loss of $90 million.
So, if the enterprise AI is 100% flawed, the digital supply chains are poisoned, biometric authentication can be bypassed, and cold storage hardware has entropy flaws. How do we protect ourselves, especially the most vulnerable users? This brings us to the final piece of our stack today, the KIDS Act legislation.
The Kids Internet and Digital Safety Act.
Mm-hmm.
This legislation is pushing for severe, sweeping mandates. It demands hard age verification for sensitive sites. It severely limits the ability of algorithm-powered recommendation engines to target minors, and it outright bans disappearing messages for any user under the age of 17.
It is a desperate attempt to legislate safety in the middle of a digital war zone. But I have to bring back our metaphors here. We talked about Spain building a concrete sea barrier in Ceuta. And we talked about the sledgehammer versus the scalpel in U.S. Medicaid policy. Are legislative acts like the KIDS Act effectively building a digital sea barrier?
It's a valid question.
A massive blunt force wall that looks tough on a campaign flyer but completely fails to solve the underlying systemic crisis. Or worse, is it a legislative sledgehammer that is going to smash adult privacy and end-to-end encryption in the name of protecting youth?
It is inevitably both. When policymakers see children drowning in algorithmic harm today, their immediate instinct is to pour concrete and build a sea barrier.
Right.
You mandate age verification because the recommendation engines are objectively, empirically, causing psychological damage to minors. But you have to simultaneously acknowledge that this legislation is a reactionary, blunt force defense mechanism against an ecosystem that is structurally hostile by design.
Right, because the internet wasn't engineered with the psychological safety of children in mind. The foundational protocols of the web were built for the frictionless, rapid transfer of data packets between academic and military nodes.
Precisely. Trying to retrofit child safety onto the modern internet via heavy-handed legislation is like trying to bolt airbags onto a motorcycle. You might mitigate a fraction of the damage in a very specific type of crash, but the vehicle itself remains inherently, fundamentally dangerous.
And when you take that inherently dangerous vehicle and you accelerate it into machine speed warfare, the mind completely boggles.
It demands a total, ground-up reimagining of how we construct digital spaces and hardware architectures. We cannot rely on enterprise AI systems that have a 100% critical flaw rate to serve as our shield against weaponized autonomous AI attackers. The math simply does not favor the defender.
Which brings us appropriately to our proverb of the day. It feels incredibly heavy, almost ominous after navigating the stack. Proverbs 4.26:27. Ponder the path of thy feet, and let all thy ways be established. Turn not to the right hand nor to the left. Remove thy foot from evil.
Ponder the path of thy feet. The phrasing implies a very deliberate, slow, highly intentional way of moving through the world. It requires you to intimately know the ground you are standing on.
And that is the ultimate profound paradox we are leaving you with today. We look at a brilliant, localized system like Mexico City's SSAT CDMX, a beautiful, life-saving AI early warning system that tracks disease and protects communities. The entirety of our future relies on scaling those exact types of systems.
It really does.
But if 100% of the enterprise AI we currently use has critical, exploitable flaws, and if the cyber landscape is officially moving at machine speed warfare, how can we possibly ponder the path of our feet when the digital ground we are walking on is fundamentally mathematically compromised? How do we establish our ways when the terrain is shifting and mutating faster than human thought can process?
That is the defining question of this decade. We have constructed a highly globalized, deeply interconnected world that requires absolutely perfect systems to function. But we are attempting to run that world on flawed installations.
We have to find a way to fix the invisible conveyor belts, and quickly, before they break completely. Adios, humans.